The weird wedding night rituals of ancient Rome. Marriage in ancient Rome was never just about love. It was about power. It was about family honor. It was about religion, fertility, social order, and control. And nowhere did all of these forces collide more intensely than on the wedding night. To modern eyes, many Roman wedding night rituals feel strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes outright shocking. But to the Romans, these customs were not only normal, they were necessary. Every gesture, every word, every action was believed to shape the future of the marriage, the household, and even the favor of the gods themselves. To understand how weird Roman wedding nights really were, we first need to understand how Romans viewed marriage itself. For ancient Romans, marriage was not a private romantic affair. It was a public institution, a legal contract, a religious obligation, a duty to ancestors and descendants who had not yet been born. Love might grow later, but it was never the main reason to marry. Most Roman marriages were arranged by families. Girls often married very young, sometimes in their early teens, while men were usually much older. By the time the wedding night arrived, the couple might barely know each other at all. This made the wedding night not just intimate, but symbolic, a ritual transition from girlhood to womanhood, from outsider to insider, from one family's control to another's authority. The Romans believed this moment was dangerous. Dangerous spiritually. Dangerous emotionally. Dangerous supernaturally. And so they surrounded it with rituals meant to protect, guide, and control what happened next. One of the strangest Roman wedding night rituals began before the bride ever reached the bed. After the wedding ceremony and feast, the bride was escorted to her new home in a loud public procession. Guests carried torches. People sang songs. Some of these songs were deliberately crude and teasing. This was not accidental. Romans believed that obscene jokes and playful insults scared away evil spirits. Laughter was protection. Noise was power. Silence, on the other hand, invited danger. As the bride approached her husband's house, she was expected to pretend to resist entering. She would pause at the doorway, sometimes even crying or hesitating. This ritualized resistance symbolized the bride's modesty. A Roman woman was expected to appear reluctant, even if she accepted the marriage. Too much eagerness was considered shameful. In some cases, the groom would physically lift the bride over the threshold. This action was loaded with meaning. Romans believed that stumbling at the doorway was a bad omen. Carrying the bride prevented her from tripping. It also symbolized her complete transfer into her husband's household. But there was an even darker belief attached to this custom. Some Romans traced it back to ancient times when brides were taken by force during tribal raids. Carrying the bride preserved the memory of conquest, a reminder that marriage was, at its core, an act of possession. Once inside the house, the bride performed another strange ritual. She anointed the doorposts with oil or animal fat and wrapped them with wool. Oil symbolized smoothness and harmony, the hope that marriage would run without friction. Wool represented domestic labor and fertility. By touching the entrance of her new home, the bride was symbolically claiming her role as the household's caretaker. Only after this was she allowed to enter fully. Inside, the bride was guided to the bedroom, but she was never alone. Married women, female relatives, and attendants followed her closely. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. One of the most bizarre rituals happened at the bed itself. The marriage bed was prepared in advance with extreme care. It was often decorated with garlands and sacred symbols. The bed was not just furniture, it was a ritual object. The bed represented the future of the family line. Before the bride lay down, she might be made to sit while older women gave instructions, advice, and warnings. These women were not chosen randomly. They were usually women who had been married only once and whose husbands were still alive. Romans believed such women carried good fortune and moral purity. Their presence was meant to transfer luck and stability to the new bride. In some cases, a child, usually a young boy, was placed briefly on the marriage bed. This act symbolized fertility and the hope for male offspring. Sons were essential in Roman society for inheritance, family name, and ancestor worship. The bride's hair was another focus of ritual attention. On her wedding day, her hair was divided into 6 sections using the point of a spear. This detail shocks many modern historians. The spear symbolized Roman masculinity, war, and authority. By dividing the bride's hair with a weapon, Romans linked marriage directly to conquest and control. Even on the wedding night, the symbolism of domination lingered. The bride's special wedding belt, tied with a complicated knot known as the Knot of Hercules, had not yet been removed. Hercules was a symbol of strength and fertility. Only the groom was allowed to untie this knot. This moment carried enormous symbolic weight. Untying the knot represented the groom's exclusive right to his wife. It was not just about intimacy, it was about legal and social authority. The act marked the final transition of the bride into married status. But perhaps the strangest belief surrounding the wedding night involved divine observation. Romans believed certain gods and spirits watched over the marriage bed. Juno, goddess of marriage, was especially important. Couples prayed to her for harmony and fertility. Other minor deities were invoked for specific aspects of married life: protection, desire, health, and childbirth. The Romans did not see the wedding night as a private act between two people. They believed it was watched, judged, and remembered by the gods. This belief explains why so many rituals focused on correct behavior rather than personal emotion. Fear of divine displeasure shaped everything. Even the timing of the wedding night mattered. Certain days were considered unlucky for marriage and consummation. Festivals connected to death or the underworld were strictly avoided. Romans believed that starting a marriage at the wrong time could doom it from the beginning. Superstition controlled intimacy. Another deeply uncomfortable aspect of Roman wedding nights was the lack of consent as we understand it today. A Roman bride was legally under the authority of her father until marriage, and under her husband's authority afterward. Her personal wishes were secondary to family arrangements. The wedding night was seen as an obligation, not a choice. This does not mean all Roman marriages were cruel or unhappy. Many couples developed mutual respect and affection over time. But the system itself prioritized social order over individual feelings. In some households, older women remained nearby during the wedding night, listening outside the bedroom door. This was not considered intrusive. It was supervision. Their role was to ensure that the ritual proceeded correctly and that no bad omens occurred. Any strange noise, prolonged silence, or unexpected interruption could be interpreted as a sign of future trouble. Even the morning after the wedding night was ritualized. The bride emerged wearing different clothing, symbolizing her new status as a married woman. Her behavior was closely observed. Her ability to integrate into household routines mattered. Immediately, there was no honeymoon, no private retreat. Life continued the next morning as if nothing unusual had happened, except everything had changed. The wedding night in ancient Rome was not about passion. It was about transformation. A girl became a woman. A stranger became family. A private act became a public foundation for future generations. And behind every strange ritual was a powerful fear: fear of chaos, fear of divine anger, fear of infertility, fear of social collapse. To the Romans, controlling the wedding night meant controlling the future. And that belief shaped some of the weirdest, most revealing rituals of the ancient world. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Roman wedding nights was the role of public humiliation and ritual teasing. To modern ears, it sounds cruel. To Romans, it was protection. During the wedding procession and even after the couple entered the house, guests often shouted jokes that were deliberately rude, embarrassing, or suggestive. These were not spontaneous insults. They were ritualized speech acts. Romans believed envy was dangerous. They feared the evil eye, the idea that jealousy or ill intent could curse a marriage before it even began. Public mockery acted as a shield. By laughing at the couple, guests symbolically reduced envy and distracted hostile forces. In Roman thinking, praise invited danger. Laughter disarmed it. This is why even respected families allowed crude songs during weddings. The goal was not to shame the bride, but to protect her from unseen threats. Another strange belief surrounded silence. Total silence on the wedding night was considered ominous. If the household became too quiet, it suggested something had gone wrong. Romans believed evil spirits preferred quiet moments, slipping unnoticed into homes. This explains why older women sometimes lingered nearby. They were not there out of curiosity. They were guardians of ritual sound and timing. Noise meant safety. Closely tied to this fear was the Roman obsession with magic. Amulets were everywhere during weddings. The bride often wore small charms under her clothing. These could include phallic symbols, animal teeth, or tiny bells. Each item had a specific purpose: to ward off infertility, illness, or malicious spirits. These objects were not considered crude. They were religious tools. Romans did not separate magic from daily life. Protective charms were as normal as clothing. The bed itself might contain hidden items, herbs, knots of wool, or symbolic objects placed beneath the mattress. Each was meant to encourage fertility or marital harmony. Even the way the bride lay down could matter. Some Roman sources mention specific postures believed to favor conception. This was not based on science, but on symbolic logic. Everything about the wedding night was shaped by hope for children, especially sons. The Roman fixation on male heirs cannot be overstated. A family without sons risked losing its name, property, and ancestral rituals. The wedding night was the first step in preventing that future. This pressure fell almost entirely on the bride. If a marriage produced no children, blame often followed her, regardless of the actual cause. Roman medical knowledge was limited, and social bias was strong. Because of this, the wedding night carried enormous emotional weight. Another deeply strange custom involved names. On the wedding night, the bride sometimes adopted a generic marital name rather than her personal one. This symbolized her absorption into her husband's family. Identity was not individual in Roman society, it was collective. A woman's status came from her relationships: daughter, wife, mother. The wedding night marked the final shedding of her girlhood identity. Romans also believed that certain words spoken during the wedding night could influence the future. This is why traditional phrases and blessings were carefully preserved. Improvisation was risky. Incorrect language could anger the gods. This fear extended to dreams. Dreams experienced on the wedding night were taken seriously. If the bride or groom reported troubling dreams, families might consult priests or interpreters the very next day. Bad dreams were not ignored. They were warnings. Another uncomfortable truth is how Roman law viewed the wedding night. Marriage was not fully complete until consummation. If the wedding night did not proceed as expected, the marriage could be questioned. This legal reality placed even more pressure on the couple. It also meant that the wedding night was not just personal, it was evidence. This is one reason witnesses remained close. Not to intrude, but to confirm that the transition from unmarried to married had truly occurred. In elite households, discretion was greater, but the expectations were the same. For poorer Romans, wedding nights were often far less private. Small homes meant thin walls, shared spaces, and little separation between family members. Privacy, again, was a luxury. The morning after brought another set of rituals. The bride's appearance was closely examined, not in a crude sense, but as a sign of adjustment. Her clothing, posture, and demeanor were read as symbols. Was she calm? Was she composed? Did she move comfortably in the household? These details mattered. Gossip spread quickly in Roman communities. A wedding night that seemed off could haunt a couple for years. The bride was expected to begin household duties almost immediately. This was not punishment. It was proof. Proof that she had transitioned successfully. Another strange belief involved food. Special foods were sometimes eaten after the wedding night to restore balance and encourage fertility. Honey was especially important. It symbolized sweetness and abundance. This is one reason the term honeymoon is often loosely connected to ancient customs, though the Roman version was far less romantic than the modern idea. Religion remained present even after the night ended. Offerings were made to household gods, thanking them for protection. Small sacrifices or prayers acknowledged that the most dangerous transition had passed. But danger never fully disappeared. Romans believed the early days of marriage were fragile. Minor arguments, illnesses, or accidents were often interpreted as signs of ritual failure. This belief created pressure to behave correctly, speak carefully, and follow tradition closely. In Roman society, marriage was not just a bond between two people. It was a structure holding families, inheritance, religion, and social stability together. And the wedding night was the keystone. Strip away the rituals, and what remains is a society deeply afraid of uncertainty, afraid of disorder, afraid of divine punishment, afraid of the future. To control those fears, Romans turned the most private moment of life into a carefully regulated ritual. What modern viewers call weird was, to them, essential. And yet, not all Roman weddings followed the same rules. Class, wealth, location, and time period changed everything. In the next part, we'll explore how these rituals differed between the rich and the poor, how myths about Roman virginity don't match reality, and what happened when wedding nights failed to meet expectations. Not all Roman wedding nights looked the same. Class, wealth, and social status shaped everything, from how rituals were performed to how strictly they were enforced. For elite Roman families, weddings were political events. Marriage linked powerful households, secured alliances, and protected property. Because of this, wedding night rituals among the upper classes were often more formal, more supervised, and more symbolically loaded. Elite homes were larger, which allowed for a greater illusion of privacy. Separate rooms, multiple attendants, and controlled access meant the couple could be shielded from public noise more easily. But this did not mean freedom. If anything, expectations were higher. Elite brides were under intense scrutiny. Their behavior reflected not just on themselves, but on generations of ancestors. A wedding night that failed to meet ritual standards could damage reputations. Families invested heavily in preparation. Priests were consulted. Auspicious dates were chosen. Omens were read carefully. Any sign of bad luck before the wedding night, a dropped torch, a torn garment, an animal behaving strangely, could cause panic. Among the lower classes, the rituals were simpler but no less meaningful. Poorer Romans lacked space, luxury, and privacy. Wedding nights often occurred in shared living areas. Family members might sleep nearby. Children were present in the household. Yet the core beliefs remained the same. Protection from spirits. Hope for fertility. Fear of disorder. Poor families relied more on spoken charms, household traditions, and inherited superstitions rather than formal priestly guidance. Their rituals were passed down orally, shaped by local customs rather than written law. One of the biggest misconceptions about Roman wedding nights involves virginity. Modern popular culture often portrays Romans as either sexually strict or completely permissive. The reality was more complex. Virginity mattered, but not in the same way it later did in Christian societies. For Roman brides, virginity before marriage was expected, especially among respectable families. It symbolized discipline, family honor, and proper upbringing. But the obsession was not moral purity. It was legitimacy. Romans cared deeply about bloodlines. A bride's virginity was important because it ensured certainty about future children's parentage. This is why the wedding night mattered so much. It was the moment that officially established the husband's claim as father of any future offspring. That said, Roman society was also pragmatic. If a bride was not a virgin, families often chose not to ask questions, as long as the marriage proceeded smoothly and children followed. Public reputation mattered more than private truth. Another myth involves romantic passion. Roman wedding nights were not expected to be emotionally intense. Emotional restraint was valued. Excessive displays of feeling were considered unstable and immature. The ideal Roman spouse was calm, controlled, and duty-focused. This mindset shaped expectations on the wedding night. The goal was not emotional connection, but successful transition. When things went wrong, however, the consequences could be serious. If a wedding night failed to meet expectations, due to illness, fear, or misunderstanding, families intervened quickly. Older women might offer advice. Religious rituals might be repeated. Prayers were intensified. Failure was not blamed on nerves. It was blamed on omens. In rare cases, marriages were questioned or annulled. This usually happened when consummation was believed not to have occurred. Roman law allowed for such disputes, especially if inheritance was at stake. This legal reality turned the wedding night into a moment of proof. Not proof of love. Proof of status. Another strange aspect of Roman wedding nights was how little the couple's personal compatibility mattered. Marriages were expected to function regardless of personality differences. Roman society believed duty overcame discomfort. Affection was something that could develop later, or not at all. Many Roman writers advised patience, moderation, and silence during the early days of marriage. Too much emotional expression was seen as disruptive. Over time, however, Roman attitudes slowly shifted. As the Republic gave way to the Empire, and as Rome absorbed cultures from across the Mediterranean, new ideas entered Roman marriage practices. Greek philosophies emphasized companionship. Eastern religions introduced different views on intimacy and devotion. These influences softened some traditions but did not erase them. The biggest change came with the spread of Christianity. Christian thinkers challenged Roman wedding customs directly. They criticized ritualized teasing, fertility magic, and the belief that gods watched the marriage bed. They emphasized moral purity, consent, and spiritual union rather than ritual control. But change was slow. For centuries, Roman-style wedding night rituals continued alongside Christian beliefs. Old customs lingered in private homes long after public attitudes shifted. This overlap created tension. Families struggled to balance tradition with new religious values. Some rituals were reinterpreted rather than abandoned. Others quietly disappeared. What remained was the core Roman fear of disorder. Even as beliefs changed, the wedding night continued to symbolize transformation. It marked the crossing of a boundary no Roman took lightly. The rituals may seem strange today. The resistance at the doorway. The carried bride. The jokes, charms, and watchful elders. But each custom reflected a society obsessed with structure, lineage, and survival. Ancient Rome was not built on romance. It was built on control. And the wedding night was one of the most controlled moments of all. In the final part, we'll pull everything together, examining what these rituals reveal about Roman views on women, power, family, and why modern audiences remain so fascinated by them. To truly understand why Roman wedding night rituals were so rigid, we have to look at how Roman society viewed women. In ancient Rome, a woman's life was defined by transitions controlled by others. First by her father, then by her husband. These transitions were not emotional milestones. They were legal and social shifts. The wedding night marked the most important of these shifts. Before marriage, a woman belonged to her father's household. After the wedding night, she belonged fully to her husband's family. This transfer was not symbolic alone. It affected property, inheritance, religious duties, and legal standing. The rituals surrounding the wedding night existed to make that transfer undeniable. Roman society feared ambiguity. A woman who existed between households was dangerous to the social order. Clear boundaries mattered. The wedding night closed the gap. This is why Roman rituals focused so heavily on control rather than comfort. The bride's resistance at the doorway, for example, was not about her feelings. It was about appearance. A respectable Roman woman was expected to appear modest and reluctant, regardless of her inner thoughts. Modesty was performative. By resisting, she demonstrated virtue. By being carried inside, she demonstrated submission to lawful authority. This pattern repeated throughout Roman marriage. Women were expected to manage households, raise children, and uphold family honor, but always under male oversight. The wedding night established this hierarchy immediately. Yet Roman women were not powerless. Within the household, married women often wielded significant influence. They managed finances, supervised servants, arranged future marriages, and preserved family traditions. The wedding night was not the end of agency, it was the beginning of a different kind of power. A Roman matron gained respect through stability, fertility, and longevity. A woman married once, faithfully, and successfully was admired. This is why older married women played such a central role in wedding night rituals. They represented success. They were living proof that the system worked. Their presence was meant to guide the bride toward that same outcome. Power dynamics were also evident in how Roman men approached the wedding night. Men were expected to demonstrate restraint and control. Excessive passion was viewed as a weakness. A man who lacked self-discipline was considered unfit to lead a household. The ideal Roman husband was firm, calm, and authoritative. This expectation shaped behavior on the wedding night as much as ritual did. Marriage was not about indulgence. It was about responsibility. Another revealing aspect of Roman wedding nights is how little emphasis was placed on personal happiness. Happiness was not a Roman goal. Stability was. Romans believed a stable household strengthened the state. Strong families produced loyal citizens. Loyal citizens maintained the empire. The wedding night was therefore political, even in private homes. Every marriage contributed to Rome's survival. This belief helps explain why Roman writers discussed marriage so openly and critically. Philosophers, politicians, and poets all commented on proper marital behavior. Marriage was public business. The wedding night was simply its most intense moment. What happens when we compare Roman practices to modern expectations? Modern societies often associate marriage with romance, emotional connection, and personal choice. The Roman model feels cold by comparison. But Romans would have found modern weddings reckless. To them, relying on emotion alone seemed dangerous. Emotions change. Duty lasts. This contrast is why Roman wedding rituals fascinate historians. They expose a worldview fundamentally different from ours. They remind us that intimacy has not always been private, and marriage has not always been personal. Even today, echoes of Roman customs remain. Carrying the bride over the threshold. Choosing lucky wedding dates. Special clothing marking marital status. These traditions survive long after their original meanings are forgotten. What once protected against spirits now feels romantic. What once enforced control now feels symbolic. The Roman wedding night also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history. Many people prefer to imagine the past as simpler or more innocent. Roman rituals show us that ancient societies were complex, anxious, and deeply concerned with control. They struggled with uncertainty just as we do, but they addressed it through ritual instead of psychology. The wedding night became a stage where fears about fertility, loyalty, lineage, and divine judgment played out all at once. And while the rituals may seem strange or even unsettling, they worked, at least by Roman standards. Rome lasted centuries. Its families endured. Its social structures held. At great personal cost, perhaps, but with remarkable consistency. In the end, the weirdness of Roman wedding night rituals tells us less about romance and more about survival. Marriage was a tool. The wedding night was a mechanism. Together, they reinforced a society built on order, hierarchy, and tradition. Understanding these rituals does not require approval. It requires context. And once that context is clear, the wedding night of ancient Rome stops being just strange and starts being revealing. Beyond the common customs practiced across Rome, ancient texts describe rarer and more extreme wedding night rituals that reveal just how deeply Romans feared disorder and misfortune. These practices were not universal. Some were regional. Others belonged to older traditions that survived only in fragments. But together, they show a society willing to ritualize almost anything if it promised control over the unknown. One such belief involved protective deception. In certain regions, the bride was deliberately given misleading instructions about parts of the wedding night ritual. The idea was not cruelty. It was misdirection. Romans believed that malevolent spirits learned by observation. If the bride herself did not fully understand what would happen next, then hostile forces could not predict or interfere with the ritual. Confusion became protection. Another unusual practice involved symbolic substitution. In a few recorded cases, a ritual object, such as a doll, figurine, or piece of cloth shaped like a human form, was placed briefly on the marriage bed before the couple used it. This object symbolically absorbed bad luck meant for the bride. Once the ritual was complete, the object was removed or destroyed. To modern minds, this sounds like superstition. To Romans, it was insurance. Some regions emphasized water rituals. Water symbolized purification, transition, and rebirth. Brides might wash their hands, feet, or hair shortly before the wedding night using water drawn at specific times or from particular sources. The water was believed to remove lingering influences from the bride's previous household. Marriage was not just a new role. It was a new identity. Another extreme belief involved celestial signs. Astrology mattered deeply to Romans. Some families consulted astrologers to determine whether the wedding night aligned with favorable planetary positions. If the stars were unfavorable, families might delay certain rituals or perform additional protective acts to compensate. The wedding night was never isolated from the cosmos. Heaven and household were connected. Roman poets occasionally criticized these excesses. Writers like Catullus and Ovid hinted that some rituals were more about performance than belief. They mocked families who obsessed over omens while ignoring emotional compatibility. But even these poets rarely rejected the rituals outright. They lived inside the system. Open defiance was rare. Another important distinction appears when we look at provincial Rome. As the empire expanded, Roman wedding customs mixed with local traditions. In Gaul, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, Roman rituals blended with indigenous beliefs. This created hybrid practices. A Roman-style procession might include local chants. A Roman marriage bed might be blessed with non-Roman symbols. The wedding night became a cultural negotiation. Rome did not erase local customs. It absorbed them. This blending made Roman wedding nights even more varied, and even stranger by modern standards. One area where misunderstanding is common involves Roman morality. Later historians, especially those writing centuries afterward, often described Roman weddings as immoral or excessive. These judgments reflected their own values more than Roman reality. Most Roman rituals were not about indulgence. They were about prevention. Preventing infertility. Preventing scandal. Preventing divine anger. Even rituals that seem humiliating or invasive today were meant to stabilize society. That does not make them gentle, but it makes them intentional. One of the most revealing details is what Romans feared most on the wedding night. It was not emotional failure. It was ambiguity. A wedding night that left questions unanswered about status, fertility, legitimacy, or divine approval was dangerous. Clarity mattered more than comfort. This is why Roman rituals appear repetitive and excessive. Redundancy was reassurance. If one charm failed, another might work. If one prayer was insufficient, another would follow. Over-ritualization was a form of anxiety management. The more rules, the fewer unknowns. Modern audiences often react strongly to these customs because they clash with contemporary ideas of privacy and consent. That reaction is understandable, but it also reveals how much our values have shifted. Where Romans saw safety in surveillance, we see intrusion. Where Romans saw order in obligation, we see oppression. Neither view exists outside history. Roman wedding night rituals are not lessons to follow, they are mirrors. They reflect a civilization built on hierarchy, tradition, and fear of chaos. A civilization that believed stability was worth almost any personal cost. This is why these rituals continue to fascinate scholars, filmmakers, and audiences today. They expose the hidden machinery of an ancient empire. Not its armies. Not its emperors. But its households. In Roman eyes, empires rose and fell inside the home. The wedding night was where that future began. And so, surrounded by jokes and charms, watched by elders and gods, burdened with expectations far beyond emotion, a Roman couple stepped into marriage not as lovers, but as participants in a system older and stronger than either of them. That is what made the Roman wedding night so strange. And that is why it mattered so much. To fully grasp how unusual Roman wedding night rituals were, it helps to compare them with another ancient culture often romanticized alongside Rome, ancient Greece. At first glance, Greek and Roman weddings appear similar. Both societies valued family lineage, legitimacy, and social order. Both treated marriage as a public institution rather than a private choice. But when it came to the wedding night, their priorities diverged in revealing ways. Greek marriage placed greater emphasis on separation. The Greek wedding night was often framed as a quiet transition, with fewer protective rituals and less communal involvement after the ceremony. Once the bride entered the household, she was expected to adapt silently. Romans, by contrast, feared silence. Where Greeks valued restraint and withdrawal, Romans valued supervision and ritual noise. Greek weddings aimed to close a chapter. Roman weddings aimed to seal it permanently. This difference reflects a deeper contrast between the two cultures. Greek philosophy often emphasized balance and moderation. Roman culture emphasized order and authority. The Roman wedding night was not about harmony between equals. It was about installing structure where chaos might emerge. This becomes even clearer when we examine how early Christianity challenged Roman marriage customs. Christian thinkers inherited Roman legal frameworks but rejected many Roman rituals outright. They criticized fertility magic, public teasing, and the belief that multiple gods hovered over the marriage bed. Christian writers reframed marriage as a spiritual union rather than a social mechanism. This created tension. Roman families continued old rituals out of habit and fear, while Christian leaders preached restraint, privacy, and moral intent. The wedding night became a battleground between old and new values. Some Roman customs faded quickly under Christian influence, especially those involving magic and charms. Others survived by being reinterpreted. The carried bride, for example, lost its association with conquest and became symbolic of care. Auspicious dates remained, but now tied to saints rather than gods. Rituals rarely disappear. They evolve. This evolution explains why modern weddings still carry echoes of Roman anxiety, even when stripped of their original meaning. We still fear bad luck. We still seek blessings. We still ritualize transition. The difference is that we now call it tradition rather than protection. Another reason Roman wedding nights remain fascinating is how often they are misunderstood in popular media. Movies and television frequently depict Roman weddings as either decadent or brutal. Both extremes miss the point. Most Roman rituals were not designed for pleasure or cruelty. They were designed for predictability. Rome was an empire built on rules. Roads, laws, calendars, military discipline, everything followed structure. Marriage was no exception. The wedding night was the moment when two family systems merged. Without ritual, that merger felt dangerous. Modern societies rely on legal systems and personal choice to manage that transition. Romans relied on symbols and repetition. Neither approach is neutral. Both reflect what a society fears most. Roman wedding nights also challenge modern assumptions about progress. It is tempting to believe history moves in a straight line toward greater freedom. But Roman women in some periods enjoyed legal protections that disappeared later. Roman divorce, for example, was relatively accessible compared to medieval norms. The wedding night, rigid as it was, existed within a system that could be surprisingly flexible elsewhere. History resists simple judgment. What remains constant is the human need to mark change. Birth, marriage, death, every society ritualizes these moments. The Roman wedding night simply concentrated that impulse to an extreme degree. It turned a private threshold into a public guarantee. And that guarantee mattered. Without it, families feared instability. Without stability, Romans feared collapse. This fear shaped an empire more than romance ever could. When we strip away modern expectations and look honestly at Roman wedding night rituals, we see a society negotiating vulnerability. Marriage made people vulnerable. It involved risk, uncertainty, and the future. Romans answered that risk with control. The rituals were strange because the fears were large. And in that sense, the Roman wedding night is not alien at all. It is human. To move even deeper into the reality of Roman wedding nights, we need to look beyond rituals and into the legal and social frameworks that governed marriage itself. Roman law shaped intimacy as much as religion did. Marriage in ancient Rome was not a single institution. It existed in different legal forms, each carrying different expectations for the wedding night and its consequences. One form placed the wife fully under the authority of her husband, transferring her legal identity into his household. Another allowed her to remain legally connected to her father's family even after marriage. These distinctions mattered. They influenced inheritance, property rights, and family loyalty. But regardless of legal structure, the wedding night still symbolized completion. Until that moment, the marriage was incomplete. This legal mindset intensified the importance of ritual. The wedding night was not simply expected, it was required to finalize a social contract. Failure to complete it created uncertainty that Roman society found deeply unsettling. Roman legal writers rarely described the wedding night directly, but their silence is revealing. They assumed it. They assumed the rituals had been followed, the transition completed, and the household stabilized. When disputes arose, however, the wedding night suddenly became visible. Inheritance cases sometimes hinged on whether a marriage had been fully realized. Accusations of improper conduct, deception, or ritual failure could surface years later. In these moments, the wedding night became evidence. Evidence not of emotion, but of legitimacy. Another often overlooked perspective is that of enslaved people. Slaves did not have legal marriages in the Roman sense. Their unions were informal and lacked legal protection. But this did not mean they lacked ritual. Enslaved communities developed their own customs around partnership and intimacy. These customs often borrowed from Roman traditions, but adapted them to harsh realities. There was no official wedding night for enslaved couples. No legal recognition. No protection from separation. Yet even in these conditions, people marked transitions. Simple rituals, shared meals, or symbolic gestures replaced formal ceremonies. The desire to give meaning to union existed even where law denied it. Freed people, formerly enslaved individuals, occupied a complicated middle ground. When freed, they gained the right to legal marriage, but social stigma followed them. Their weddings were often simpler, and their wedding nights less ritualized. Still, the expectations remained. Fertility mattered. Stability mattered. Respectability mattered. The wedding night served as a declaration: this household was legitimate. Roman writers sometimes mocked freed people for imitating elite rituals. But imitation was the point. Ritual was social language. To perform it was to claim belonging. Another revealing source comes from Roman satire. Satirists joked about anxious parents, nervous brides, and overbearing relatives hovering near the bedroom. These jokes worked because audiences recognized them. The wedding night was stressful. Not because of intimacy, but because of expectations. Everyone involved feared failure. Failure reflected not just on the couple, but on the family's competence and honor. This collective anxiety explains why Roman rituals were so persistent. They were rehearsed solutions to shared fear. Historians continue to debate how strictly these rituals were followed in practice. Written sources describe ideals more than reality. Everyday life was likely messier. Not every bride resisted the doorway. Not every family consulted omens. Not every ritual was completed perfectly. But the ideals mattered. They shaped behavior even when ignored. That is the power of ritual. It defines what should happen, even when life refuses to cooperate. The Roman wedding night, then, was less about what occurred in a room and more about what society believed must occur. Belief shaped reality. This is why Roman marriage endured across centuries of political change. Empires fell, gods changed, borders shifted, but households remained structured by ritual. The wedding night anchored that structure. When modern historians study these customs, they are not searching for scandal. They are searching for meaning. The wedding night reveals how Romans understood gender, power, duty, and fear. It shows how a civilization managed uncertainty without modern tools. And it reminds us that intimacy has always been shaped by culture. What feels private today was once public responsibility. What feels strange now once felt necessary. The Roman wedding night was not designed to make people happy. It was designed to make society stable. And by Roman standards, it succeeded. To understand the emotional reality behind Roman wedding night rituals, we need to look past law and tradition and consider the psychological pressure placed on those involved. Roman society rarely discussed feelings openly, but the weight of expectations surrounding marriage was immense. For a Roman bride, the wedding night was not just a transition, it was a test. From childhood, girls were taught what was expected of them. Modesty, obedience, composure, silence. These were not abstract virtues. They were survival skills in a society that judged women relentlessly. By the time the wedding night arrived, a bride carried years of instruction, warning, and fear. fear of doing something wrong, fear of angering the gods, fear of disappointing her family. The rituals were meant to guide her, but they also confined her. Rituals reduce uncertainty, but they also remove choice. The bride did not need to decide how to act. Tradition decided for her. This was both protection and limitation. For Roman grooms, the pressure was different but equally real. Men were expected to lead immediately. There was no gradual adjustment. Authority was assumed from the first night. A man who appeared uncertain or overwhelmed risked ridicule. Roman masculinity prized control above all else. The wedding night was a public milestone disguised as a private moment. Everyone knew when it happened. Everyone knew what it meant. Failure was not invisible. This is why Roman writers advised restraint and seriousness during early marriage. Emotional excess suggested instability. Stability was masculine virtue. When modern readers imagine Roman wedding nights, they often project modern emotions onto ancient expectations. This creates misunderstanding. Romans did not expect the wedding night to be emotionally fulfilling. They expected it to be effective. Effectiveness meant order. Effectiveness meant legitimacy. Effectiveness meant continuity. Another area often misunderstood is the role of affection. Affection was not forbidden in Roman marriage. It simply was not foundational. Many Roman couples developed strong bonds over time. Letters, epitaphs, and household inscriptions reveal genuine attachment between spouses. But affection was expected to grow after marriage, not before it. The wedding night marked the beginning of that process, not its culmination. This reverse sequence feels strange to modern audiences, but it made sense within Roman logic. Duty created familiarity. Familiarity allowed affection. Emotion followed structure. This belief also shaped how Romans understood failure in marriage. A troubled wedding night did not automatically mean a failed marriage. Rituals could be repeated. Omens could be reinterpreted. Behavior could be corrected. Marriage was a system, not a feeling. As long as the system held, individual discomfort was secondary. This brings us to one of the most revealing aspects of Roman wedding night rituals, their flexibility over time. Although Romans prized tradition, they were not frozen in it. Customs evolved quietly. Ritual teasing softened. Magical practices faded. Supervision became less intrusive. These changes did not happen suddenly. They occurred gradually, often unnoticed by those living through them. What remained constant was the belief that marriage mattered beyond the couple. This belief survived the fall of Rome itself. Medieval Europe inherited Roman legal concepts of marriage. Early Christian ceremonies borrowed Roman structure even as they rejected Roman theology. The idea that marriage must be marked, witnessed, and validated endured. Even today, weddings remain public declarations. Witnesses sign documents. Dates are chosen carefully. Ritual words are repeated. The Roman impulse persists. When people say they want a proper wedding, they are echoing Roman logic, the belief that ritual gives legitimacy. This is why Roman wedding night rituals still resonate. They sit at the intersection of intimacy and authority. They remind us that private lives have always been shaped by public expectation. And they challenge the comforting idea that marriage has ever been purely personal. The Romans understood something modern societies often forget. Transitions are unsettling. Marriage changes identity, responsibility, and future. Without ritual, that change feels uncontrolled. Roman wedding nights wrapped that change in tradition. They made uncertainty manageable. And in doing so, they revealed the core of Roman civilization, a culture that feared chaos more than discomfort and valued order above emotion. The rituals may feel strange now, but they worked for the people who believed in them. And belief, in any era, is powerful. One of the most revealing sources for understanding Roman marriage does not come from law books or ritual manuals. It comes from stone. Roman epitaphs, inscriptions carved on tombs, tell us how Romans wanted marriages to be remembered. These short texts reveal values far more clearly than poetry or satire. Again and again, Roman husbands praised wives not for passion or romance, but for constancy. She was faithful. She managed the household well. She bore children. She caused no scandal. These were the qualities that mattered. The wedding night was the invisible starting point behind every epitaph. It was assumed, never described, but always present. The successful marriage began there. Some epitaphs explicitly mention that a woman married only once and remained with the same man until death. This was considered exceptional and worthy of honor. Such inscriptions tell us that marriage was evaluated over time, not by initial emotion. The wedding night was not judged in isolation. It was judged by its outcome. Children provided the clearest confirmation that the wedding night had fulfilled its purpose. Roman families marked births carefully. Naming ceremonies, household offerings, and public acknowledgments all reinforced legitimacy. A child born soon after marriage raised no suspicion. Timing mattered. A child born too early could spark gossip. This is why the wedding night carried such symbolic importance. It established the timeline. Legitimacy was a calculation. Another layer of pressure surrounded the concept of consent. Modern readers often ask whether Roman brides consented to marriage or the wedding night. The honest answer is uncomfortable. Consent, as we understand it today, was not the framework Romans used. Marriage was a family decision. The bride's agreement was expected, but not central. Social harmony mattered more than personal autonomy. This does not mean Roman women were unaware or incapable of resistance. Some resisted through delay, illness, or appeal to relatives. But the system itself prioritized order. The wedding night was an obligation within that system. Historians continue to debate how Roman women experienced this moment internally. Written sources rarely preserve women's voices directly. What we do know comes from fragments, letters, complaints, legal disputes, and poetry written by men about women. These sources are incomplete. Silence does not equal contentment. It equals absence of record. What is clear is that Roman society normalized pressure. Pressure to comply. Pressure to perform roles. Pressure to suppress fear. The wedding night concentrated that pressure into a single moment. And yet, Roman marriages were not universally unhappy. Many couples built stable, cooperative lives. Some inscriptions express affection and mutual respect. The Roman system did not forbid happiness. It simply did not prioritize it. Happiness was a possible outcome, not a requirement. This perspective helps explain why Roman wedding night rituals were so resilient. They did not depend on emotion. They depended on belief. As long as people believed rituals worked, they worked. Another reason these customs endure in historical imagination is their theatrical nature. Resistance at the doorway. Carrying the bride. Public teasing. Sacred knots. These are vivid actions. They translate easily into story. But focusing on spectacle can distract from substance. The true function of Roman wedding night rituals was bureaucratic in spirit, even when symbolic in form. They processed a person from one legal category into another. They closed one identity and opened another. Modern societies use documents, signatures, and databases. Rome used ritual. Different tools. Same goal. This realization helps explain why Roman marriage practices influenced later civilizations so deeply. The idea that marriage must be witnessed, validated, and publicly recognized did not disappear with the empire. It evolved. What began as protection against spirits became protection against disputes. What began as ritual authority became legal authority. The Roman wedding night sits at the root of that transformation. It marks the moment where private life became public fact. And that concept still shapes marriage today. When we study Roman wedding night rituals, we are not peering into a distant, alien world. We are looking at an early version of our own. A society struggling to balance personal lives with collective stability. A society that believed order was fragile and needed constant reinforcement. The wedding night was one of those reinforcements. And in that sense, it mattered far more than romance ever could. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, it is clear that the wedding night in ancient Rome was far more than a personal milestone. It was a mirror of Roman society itself. At first glance, these rituals may seem strange, even uncomfortable. Resistance at the doorway. Public teasing. Magical charms. Supervised intimacy. But beneath the surface lies a culture preoccupied with survival, legitimacy, and control. Every ritual served a purpose: to manage uncertainty, to maintain order, to ensure the continuity of families and, by extension, the state. The Romans were obsessed with preventing chaos. And marriage, especially the wedding night, represented one of the moments most vulnerable to disorder. The weight of expectation rested not only on the bride and groom but on entire families, communities, and the favor of the gods. This pressure manifested in complex ceremonies, repeated symbols, and a pervasive attention to detail. Even the smallest mistake could be interpreted as an omen. Every misstep or silence was significant. And yet, these rituals were not rigidly oppressive for the Romans themselves. They were reassuring. They provided clarity and structure in a world that otherwise felt unpredictable. Modern audiences often react with fascination or horror because we interpret these rituals through the lens of contemporary values. Privacy, personal choice, and romantic intimacy are central to modern weddings. In contrast, Romans viewed the wedding night as a public transition, a proof of legitimacy, and a stabilization of social hierarchy. Understanding this difference is key. The apparent strangeness of Roman wedding nights is not arbitrary. It reflects a worldview in which duty, lineage, and societal order outweighed individual desire. Intimacy was less about emotion and more about fulfilling roles defined by law, custom, and religion. Yet, paradoxically, these rituals also reveal something profoundly human. The fear of the unknown, the desire to protect loved ones, the hope that the future will be secure, these impulses are timeless. The Romans ritualized them, we live them in different ways. The wedding night becomes, therefore, a lens through which we can examine Roman society, its values, anxieties, and structures. It shows how culture shapes even the most intimate aspects of life. It reminds us that rituals, no matter how strange they seem today, often serve essential psychological and social functions. It also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and agency in ancient civilizations. The bride's autonomy was limited, the husband's authority emphasized, and society's collective fears dominated the private sphere. But within this framework, women often exercised influence, guided households, and ensured continuity. Power and constraint were intertwined. From the threshold of the doorway to the rituals at the bed, from public mockery to private prayers, Roman wedding nights were carefully orchestrated performances of social, legal, and religious order. They reveal a culture that treated transition as sacred, intimacy as duty, and domestic life as central to the survival of civilization itself. And perhaps that is why these rituals continue to fascinate us. They remind us that human concerns, security, legacy, and family, are eternal. They remind us that even what seems private has always been shaped by society. And they remind us that history is rarely simple or sentimental. It is complex, layered, and often deeply strange. The wedding night of ancient Rome may feel distant and alien, but its logic is clear once we understand the society behind it. The rituals were not arbitrary. They were deliberate. They were functional. They were a society's response to uncertainty, anxiety, and the ever-present demand for order. In the end, studying these customs offers more than curiosity. It offers insight into how civilizations organize human life, how rituals encode values, and how fear and hope shape tradition. It allows us to see ourselves reflected in the past, in different forms, but facing similar questions. How do we protect our families? How do we preserve order? How do we navigate transition, uncertainty, and expectation? The Romans answered with ritual. And for anyone studying them today, that answer is as strange, fascinating, and revealing as the wedding night itself. Even after centuries of study, Roman wedding night rituals continue to challenge historians because the sources are fragmentary and often contradictory. Much of what we know comes from literature, legal codes, inscriptions, and archaeological evidence, but each type of source reflects different priorities and perspectives. Literary texts, for example, are often idealized or satirical. Poets like Ovid, Catullus, and Martial describe weddings in ways designed to entertain, mock, or moralize. Their accounts highlight exaggerated customs, boisterous teasing, dramatic resistance, and clever trickery. Yet these exaggerations tell us something real. They reflect cultural anxieties about marriage, propriety, and social control. Legal texts, in contrast, are formal and prescriptive. They reveal what marriage should look like according to Roman law. They define legitimacy, inheritance, and obligations, but they rarely reveal the personal experiences of the bride and groom. What we learn from law is the framework behind the wedding night, its function as proof, its connection to property, and its role in structuring society. Inscriptions and epitaphs provide a complementary perspective. They show what Romans valued and remembered. Successful marriages were commemorated not for passion, but for order, fidelity, and continuity. The wedding night, though rarely mentioned explicitly, is the invisible hinge connecting these outcomes. Archaeology adds another layer. Household artifacts, charms, small amulets, and bed-related objects suggest that fertility, protection, and ritual performance were central to daily life. These items illuminate the private dimensions of a wedding night, often lost in textual sources. One striking pattern emerges: ritualized anxiety. Romans ritualized fear itself. Every charm, every joke, every elder's supervision was a response to uncertainty. They could not control the gods, illness, or social gossip, but they could manage perception, intention, and action. Ritual made uncertainty tangible and manageable. The wedding night was the apex of this process. It concentrated legal authority, religious obligation, and family surveillance into a single, highly symbolic moment. And yet, within this structure, Romans demonstrated subtle flexibility. Regional variations, family traditions, and individual improvisation ensured that no wedding night was truly identical to another. Historians often debate the extent of coercion in Roman marriage. Modern concepts of consent do not map neatly onto Roman practice. The bride's compliance was expected but nuanced. Women exercised agency through timing, clever compliance, and the use of trusted intermediaries, like older female relatives. Authority was clear, but maneuvering within it was possible. At the same time, the emotional stakes were real. Even if emotion was not central, fear, anxiety, and hope were palpable. The wedding night represented social, legal, and cosmic order. Success or failure resonated far beyond the couple's bedroom. It affected family honor, inheritance, and the favor of the gods. It is also important to recognize how modern fascination shapes our interpretation. We are drawn to the weirdness of Roman customs because they clash with contemporary expectations of privacy, romance, and choice. Yet these rituals were neither arbitrary nor purely theatrical. They were practical, symbolic, and deeply embedded in societal logic. Modern weddings often retain echoes of Roman logic. Witnesses validate marriage. Dates are carefully chosen. Objects are exchanged. Traditions are repeated. While our reasons have changed, the underlying purpose remains: to mark transition, ensure recognition, and create continuity. The Roman wedding night also reveals the balance between vulnerability and control. Marriage placed immense responsibility on both parties. It demanded public compliance and private adaptation. It combined fear and ritual, supervision and symbolism, legal obligation and spiritual expectation. In examining these practices, we gain insight not only into ancient Rome but into the human need for structure during transitional moments. The wedding night was simultaneously intimate and public, personal and political, private and ritualized. It was a microcosm of Roman civilization itself. Even centuries later, this duality continues to intrigue. Historians, archaeologists, and cultural commentators debate interpretation, meaning, and ethics. Some emphasize coercion, others emphasize protection. Some focus on spectacle, others on legitimacy. But all agree on one point: the Roman wedding night mattered profoundly. It was central to the organization of households, the continuity of families, and the reproduction of social order. And that is why, over 2,000 years later, we remain fascinated by it. Having explored the customs, laws, superstitions, and social pressures surrounding Roman wedding nights, we can now step back and consider what these rituals reveal about the civilization itself. The wedding night was not a simple personal moment. It was a convergence of family expectation, legal authority, religious ritual, and social order. Every gesture, every charm, every joke or symbolic act was purposeful. Each served to mark the transition from unmarried to married, from one household to another, and from girlhood to wifehood. The strangeness of these rituals to modern eyes is understandable. Resistance at the doorway, public teasing, magical charms, supervision by elders, all seem alien to our concepts of privacy and consent. Yet these customs were functional within the context of Roman life. They managed fear, reduced uncertainty, and reinforced hierarchy. They ensured that the marriage was socially, legally, and ritually recognized. Beyond practicality, the rituals reveal Roman values. Duty was prioritized over emotion. Legitimacy mattered more than passion. Order was more important than comfort. Marriage was a microcosm of Roman civilization itself, structured, regulated, and intensely concerned with continuity. Women's experiences in this system were complex. On the one hand, the bride's autonomy was constrained. On the other hand, she often wielded substantial influence within her household. Older women guided her through. Rituals. Fertility, management of the home, and family honor allowed her power within defined boundaries. Her success validated the system, her failures were socially significant. Men, too, faced expectations. Authority, composure, and control were demanded from the groom. Success was measured not in emotion, but in leadership, household stability, and the continuation of lineage. The wedding night tested these abilities, making them publicly observable while still framed as private transition. Regional differences, class distinctions, and historical shifts added further complexity. The rituals of elite Romans were more formal and supervised, while commoners relied on simpler charms and inherited oral traditions. The expansion of the empire introduced hybrid practices, blending Roman norms with local customs. Later Christian influence transformed certain aspects, emphasizing moral conduct and spiritual union, but the underlying structure of witness, ritual, and legitimacy persisted. What makes these rituals fascinating is not just their strangeness, but their universality. Every culture ritualizes transition. Every society finds ways to mark milestones, to protect the vulnerable, and to assert legitimacy. Roman wedding nights concentrated these impulses into a highly symbolic, highly structured moment. In studying them, we also confront the tension between public and private life. The wedding night was intensely personal, yet it was never entirely private. Family, law, religion, and society were all present. Success and failure were observed, recorded, and judged. Modern readers may be uncomfortable with this intrusion, but for Romans, it was reassurance. Order required visibility. Security required ritual. These customs also illuminate timeless human concerns: the fear of uncertainty, the desire to protect family, the hope for continuity, and the attempt to shape the future. Romans addressed these anxieties not through individual choice alone, but through collective, symbolic action. Finally, the legacy of Roman wedding nights is visible today. We continue to witness and validate marriages. We repeat traditions, exchange symbolic objects, choose lucky dates, and mark the transition from single life to married life. While meanings have changed, the human impulse to ritualize and safeguard life's turning points persists. The wedding night of ancient Rome may feel strange, even alien, but it was neither arbitrary nor cruel. It was deliberate, functional, and deeply revealing. It reflects a society that valued structure, feared chaos, and invested enormous care in transitions that shaped the future. By understanding these rituals, we gain insight not only into ancient Rome but into the enduring human need to manage uncertainty, protect legacy, and define identity. They remind us that intimacy, legality, and social order have always been intertwined, and that the past, strange as it may seem, continues to influence how we mark life's most important moments today. The weird wedding night rituals of ancient Rome were, in the end, an expression of civilization itself, careful, symbolic, and profoundly mattered.